Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for the Q&A of Firestorm 77. I hope that all of you enjoyed it as much as I did. Please remember that it's available for an audience award, so don't forget to rate it and the other films you finish at the end. I also want to start off by thanking our major film sponsors, as well as the sponsors of this particular film, Covalop Inc., KVEC News Talk 920 AM, and Films for Good through Bob and Christine Williams. And now I'm truly excited to have with us today the film's directors, editors, and producers, Chris Height and Dennis Ford, as well as producer and author Joseph Valencia. And so with that, I'll just start off by saying, why did you tackle this particular project? Did either of you know Joseph, who wrote the book, of course, on which the film is based?
Well, I'll start it out and then let Dennis maybe fill in some of the blanks. For me, this idea came on my radar. It all started at Allen Hancock College in a film class that I was teaching, which Dennis was a student. And we struck up a good rapport, and we'd stay after class each day and discuss cinema. And one day, Dennis had mentioned that something he had experienced in his own personal life seemed rather cinematic to him. And he went on to describe it in about 1 to 2 minutes. And what that description was is what became our film, Firestorm 77. And Dennis didn't know he was doing a pitch to me at that time, but how he described it was so cinematic, and it just absolutely drew me in. And for me, that was the true allure of the story, was that Dennis's personal experience and his perspective and the staying power of that event some 40 years later definitely struck a chord with him. And for me, it just gave me immediate buy-in.
Mm-hmm.
For me, I was at the fire in 1977. I was a very young man at 20 years old, and I was ordered to go out and fight the fire. And I didn't pay much attention to it at the time. It wasn't well managed. I knew that there was a lot of frustration and a lot of chaos at the fire. That said, I went ahead and went into a career, which I retired in 2015 from that career. But I think about 10 years ago, I talked to somebody in the office next to me who I told him about the fire. And he said to me something to the effect, you shouldn't make up stories like that. That's not funny. And it kind of incensed me, but I sort of put it on a back burner. And once I retired, I decided to read Joe's book, because I think that was a bit of a catalyst, that conversation with that individual. So when I retired, I read Joe's book, and a few months later, I talked to Chris. And the answer is we both don't know Chris. I was by serendipity was able to run into Joe at a restaurant one night, and I brought up the whole conversation, and I think Joe was excited to jump into it.
Mm-hmm. So Joe, from your perspective, how much of the movie is completely based on your book?
Well, the book goes into a lot of detail. I've heard people say, sometimes books go into greater detail, but this film captures things that the book doesn't really can show. And that is the human emotion of what affected these people that were at the fire. And my book goes into great detail. It's a great historical account, I believe. And because I was like a detective trying to find out everything about it. And I was at the fire, and I was still had a curiosity as to what really happened out there. There were so many things, but the film, in my opinion, brings out this emotion and this feelings that 44 years later still resonates with these men that are being interviewed in the film. And Chris and Dennis and I, we put together something that I think will really show the young men and women who started out in this thing. and went through this journey, life and death in some cases, and then have kind of returned. Some not all whole, but returned nonetheless, try to deal with this. And so it has, I think, a different aspect because it brings out PTSD in a way that my book didn't really bring it out.
Okay, great. Well, clearly you had many challenges in producing this movie. One of them, it seemed to me, was finding a way to portray the tragic wildfire, nearly 43 years old now. Can you talk about that particular challenge?
That was probably the number one challenge for us from a filmmaking, from a production technique standpoint, was just the distance between now and then, and how to illustrate that on screen for contemporary audiences in a way that's meaningful and keeps their engagement with the project. And we're hoping we were successful in that regard. It took us copious amounts of research to come up with all the archival video and photos that we used in it. I mean, just countless hours of man hours to procure those, which I have to thank Dennis largely for that. My task largely in editing was to construct a pace, a mood, and a tone. And at times there's wistfulness and some comedy, but at other times you get a sense that there were some dire circumstances that individuals felt themselves in. So we were juggling a whole bowl of emotions. And as Joe stated, his book was a fantastic foundation for us going into this. But what we really wanted to capture, more so than just kind of a objective data point on it, was what was it like to be there? What went through one's mind as they were faced with these very life and death situations?
Mhm. So another challenge was to infuse drama and tension as you're recreating the scene. So perhaps you could talk, all of you could talk about your approach to doing that, because that is a whole nother level, it seems to me.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I'm glad to start it out, and I want Joe and Dennis to certainly add their perspective, because again, I'm kind of a third party on this. I'm definitely involved in the filmmaking aspect, but for them, this is personal. They were there, and I know their objective in the course of making this film. But for me, I can say one thing we were blessed with was just storytellers, participants who remember this vividly to this day. And they were able to express that sense of drama. And for us, it was just a matter of finding the complementary images to go with that. And so I think we had a fantastic starting point in that everyone who participated in this was so eager and forthcoming about their experience that it made our experience as filmmakers all the more enjoyable, having that privilege of being able to tell their stories.
Mhm.
I don't think our intention was even to go to PTSD as well. We wanted to tell a historical account, but through the interviews, it came to the surface. And again, it was withheld for many of those for men and women for about 43 years. We did go out to the base, and you saw it in the last part. And the part they wouldn't let us film is when they apologized to each other, because there was situations where they had hurt the other person, not intentionally, but because of the chaos of the fire. There was circumstances where the other person had gotten hurt, both mentally and physically. And so they made sure when we weren't looking to have a little group session and apologize to each other for, this is something from 43 years ago.
These were firefighters on the scene.
These were firefighters, yes. But I want to explain to you, I was a firefighter, but I wasn't a firefighter. I was what was called an augmentee. An augmentee is a nice technical term that the military uses for what I would call is a gopher. So a gopher is somebody who gets told to go out and deal with this, and they are told to deal with whatever it is, at least in this case, without any training or personal protective equipment. So there was 250 of us out there on that fire, along with the firemen, and there was very young firemen, in their 18 and 19s that were out there. So there was a lot of young people there, still not mature enough, and that's, I'll say for myself, not mature enough to deal with what was thrown at them that day. So there was a lot of emotion in it because it was emotional. But it's interesting that it comes out 43 years later. It's in the interviews.
Yes, yeah, it clearly does. And also, you clearly worked and tried to develop various techniques to infuse drama and tension. You know, whether it was the musical score or the use of different images. So it struck me at that. And if you want to talk about that, but first, Joseph, do you have anything you'd like to add on how you thought the team infused drama and tension into this film?
Well, we were very fortunate. When I wrote the book, there was existing a video that was done. There were photographs. There was even audio. Of course, when we're trying to build upon this, we don't have everything there. Not everything was filmed, obviously, but boy, what a great start we had. Plus, we had the people. I had just written the book 10 years earlier in 2004. Well, more than 10 years. So we had people that we called up, and every one of them to a T wanted to talk about this. And that's how much it wasn't a strong effort, hardly, to get these people to talk about that. And I'll just say that, I was a 19-year-old fireman at the time, working for the Santa Barbara County Fire Department. I was a reserve, and earlier that season, I had been a hotshot. So I was with a crew of people that we were very loyal to one another and very close and very experienced, even though I was young, very experienced working together. But we had winds that were clocked at 117 miles an hour that day. So we were involved in the fire it was wind-driven fire, and a lot of, even the best intentions can be folly in a situation like that.
What was the most difficult part about this movie and creating this movie in your mind, Chris?
Well, again, just creating that sense of authenticity. We didn't want to do a disservice to anyone who had experienced this personally. And by the same token, we wanted it to be accessible for people who are coming to it just through the form of the picture itself. We feel confident with what we did, and we've had feedback from all the participants. Just to speak to, that sense of drama that you were talking about, our goal from the beginning was to just make it as intense as possible. And for me, I was always worried we were going too far with it, but I used Dennis and Joe as barometers. And at any moment I felt we needed to pull back, they were always saying, no, charge forward. It needs to be more intense in that moment, because they really wanted to bring out that sense of what it was like to be on the spot in those winds with those 40-foot high walls of flame around you. And hopefully we were successful in that regard.
Yeah. I mean, you also use techniques like the eye, the close-up of the eye. Can you talk about that, for example?
We really wanted to make this, again, when you see established cinema on firefighting or movies about firefight, and there's a good number of them, they tend to again come to the table with the notion of with the established fact that everyone's coming to this as a firefighter who's volunteered for this position. And as Dennis mentioned, there was a large portion of people who were fighting this fire who had no training, and if they were surveyed, probably would say they didn't want to be out there fighting the fire, but they didn't have a choice in that matter. And so we wanted it to get really personal. We didn't want it to be this large, wide spectrum of what it's like to fight a fire. We wanted it to be, what's it this person at this moment in this car that's on fire? This could possibly be their final moments. And so we went to some extreme close-ups, footage that exhibited that in those moments to really draw out the intensity. And of course, we tried out a number of musical tracks because, again, we wanted that score to also push the intensity going forward. We thought a lot about just the overall presentation. We wanted to do the interviews in kind of this vacuous space, so we shot everyone in this black background. So as not to have any distractions in terms of the environment they were in. It pulls it all back to what the person is telling you in regards to what they experienced at that moment. So a use of those visual techniques teaming together with what's hopefully an intense editing plan got us to where we are with the film.
Did you all receive any negative reaction from Vandenberg Air Force officials, given the conclusions that you addressed and the lessons learned?
So we have worked with several of them, and one of them is Mark Smith, who's an assistant fire chief. What happened? What happened from the fire was that Vandenberg realized they couldn't fight wildland fires. So they realized that in 1978, and they have spent years creating their hotshots. So our event is again, I'll use the word catalyst for the hotshots out of Vandenberg. So we in fact justify what they're doing. And, I will stand up to anybody and say, you need hotshots here, because I was the person without education out there with a flathead shovel, looking at a wall of fire. You need professional people to fight fires. And so I think they were in agreement with us, because we were part of that, we're part of their justification. And they do have to deal with government officials, let's say at Washington, D.C., who will tell them they do not need hotshots out here. They've gone through some budget go-arounds just recently over that. And I know you live on the Central Coast, and so we have lots of fires here. You need hotshots.
I thought, as someone who has covered wildfires, but also as a journalist and editor, but also just living here, and I think that your general public is far more attuned to what wildfires can do these days, given the intensity of them and the volume of them today. But also it's particularly striking then to see the visuals from 1977 and to see you guys without any protective gear, no equipment. It's just a complete stark contrast. And I think that really drove home your message that you guys had no training and had no personal protective equipment. The communication was poor. You lost your commander and the fire chief and the assistant fire chief. Just devastating.
If you add the winds to it, as Joe said, it's hurricane force winds. It's 100 miles an hour. You think to yourself while you're out there, I can't even fall because the wind is supporting you so much.
Mm-hmm.
But in fact, you can fall. Of course, gravity will always knock you down. But and then the wind just does all kinds of Venturi effects. So it comes down a canyon, then it decides to go back up the canyon, and then so there's just this whole chaos. You can't hear. You've heard several of the people say their doors almost came off when they opened their car doors. It really was a fire in a hurricane, and that's really what it was.
So you would say then that Vandenberg officials appreciate your film because it supports the changes they've made and really documents it well and correct? I'm just trying to get at that. Okay.
Yeah, I would think so. I don't know, Joe, or any of you guys have anything to say about that?
I did. I wrote my book, and I was quite frankly a little bit fearful. It brought out some things when I wrote the book, which are in the film too. There was a culture clash between Air Force and civilian firefighters, different ways how they did things. Some people were experienced and others were not as much. The military was involved because their commander had been killed. Everything that happened, people were dealing with their organizations. But one thing I know for sure is they were loyal to their organization, loyal to each other, and there was great integrity. Yes, there were issues, there were mistakes, but the winds were so strong that I'll say even today, and Brandon Page said this, he said that even today, any fire department would struggle with a fire like that, with winds like that. In fact, today they may just, with intelligence of weather and winds and knowledge of what the winds are going to do, they might just stand back and not go in. Mm-hmm. But back then we didn't have that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what did you all learn from making this movie?
Well, I'll start out because this has been a learning thing for me. I came into this a bit angry at the whole story, and again, that person that I talked to 10 years was probably the catalyst. But I had blame that I put on people. But what I came to realize was that you really can't fight Mother Nature. She's going to do what she wants to do, and if you attempt to get in her way, she's going to do what she wants to do to you. And it's not the same thing, but even today's COVID-19 and the people on the front lines, there's only so much you can do, when you're put into a circumstance without training or without any knowledge of what you're dealing with. And so, I learned to accept what happened as pretty much, well, maybe it was art folly to go in there and fight a fire in a hurricane, in hurricane winds. But I've kind of come to the belief that we all did the best we could. And that's the bottom line. We all did the best we could. So I don't really carry anything with me anymore. Now, some of the other people may disagree with that. I don't know that. But I've sort of forgiven that situation because it was much more complex than I had thought it was originally.
Understand. Chris, and then Joseph.
Sure. Well, for me, this film just exposed to me personally, and I think in what it does as a finished motion picture, is it's exposing many things that, this is a story that's taking place 40 some years ago, but many of the topics covered in it we're only now starting to address, from climate enhanced wind driven fires to the idea of PTSD. The USA Today published a report that showed in 2017 there were more death by suicide in the firefighting community than there were actually in the course of duty. And that's a staggering fact. That same report also showed that there simply isn't an infrastructure in place to effectively deal with issues like PTSD and depression, which those in the fire community are 5 times as likely to experience. And so I think this film shows that a lot of things happened in 1977 that institutions weren't prepared to handle, but we're hoping to stack that up against now in 2021 as a barometer to say what needs to be done to go even further, so that incidents like this don't happen again, and so that those working in these types of situations have the support they need, both physically and mentally, to go forward. So for me, it's just really the idea of that comparison and contrast over 40 years. And for us as a society to ask, have we done enough to address these types of issues? And what are we going to do to be proactive in the future?
Terrific. Joseph, would you like to add anything?
Sure. Yeah, I kind of go with Chris there too. I think this film, and what I've learned, is the amount of PTSD that you see in the interviews. The book just didn't contain that as much as the film does. Also, for myself, it was always a curiosity, even though I was there, to find out what happened in certain situations. And I'm satisfied, but still unsatisfied, because I think there's still things to be found out about this fire. And we're finding them out just recently. And so, but there's also another thing too, is for myself, there's a spirituality about this whole thing too, for myself and I think others. Spirituality of what got us through this and what's carrying us through. And I see people who go through cancer or the loss of a child and the trauma, and we've gone through some trauma, and it's a journey that we're all going through, and it's part of life for many of us. And that's what I've kind of learned from this.
Well, one quick last question. We have about 3 minutes and I want to wrap it up. But Chris, as the filmmaker here and the professor at Hancock of Film, are you working on another film at the moment? And can you give us a 20-second summary of it?
Sure. Well, Dennis and I just had this discussion the other day. We are officially just in what we'd call discovery phase, meaning what do we want to do next? We don't have anything solidified, but we're looking to explore our next challenge together, I believe.
Oh, that's terrific. Ah, that's excellent. Well, do you think it'll be a documentary again?
Most likely, most
Mhm.
likely.
Okay. Well, with that, I just want to thank all three of you again for a wonderful, insightful conversation on this very important subject that I think people care a lot about, especially as they see the wildfires raging today, in this environment. And I also want to thank our major film sponsors and the sponsors of this particular film, Covella, KVEC News Talk 920, and Films for Good through Bob and Christine Williams. And with that, everyone, don't forget to vote for this film and others. And thank you again, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Very much.
Thank you. Really appreciate it. Great meeting you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.